Hi, I'm Bruce Braden, editor of You Will Say I'm No Christian, the Thomas Jefferson John Adams Correspondence on Religion, Morals, and Values, Prometheus Books, 2005. Today I'd like to read to you a dissertation on the Canon and Feudal Law written by John Adams in his youth. Since the promulgation of Christianity, the two greatest systems of tyranny that have sprung from this original are the Canon and Feudal Law. The desire of dominion, that great principle by which we have attempted to account for so much good and so much evil, is, when properly restrained, a very useful and noble movement in the human mind. But when such restraints are taken off, it becomes an encroaching, grasping, restless, and ungovernable power. Numberless have been the systems of iniquity contrived by the great for the gratification of this passion in themselves. But in none of them were they ever more successful than in the invention and establishment of the Canon and Feudal Law. By the former of these, the Canon Law, the most refined, sublime, extensive, and astonishing constitution of policy that ever was conceived by the mind of man, was framed by the Romish clergy for the aggrandizement of their own order. All the epithets I have here given to the Romish policy are just, and will be allowed to be so when it is considered that they even persuaded mankind to believe faithfully and undoubtedly that God Almighty had entrusted them with the keys of heaven, whose gates they might open and close at pleasure, with a power of dispensation over all the rules and obligations of morality, with authority to license all sorts of sins and crimes, with a power of disposing princes and absolving subjects from allegiance, with a power of procuring or withholding the rain of heaven and the beams of the sun, with the management of earthquakes, pestilence, and famine, nay, with a mysterious, awful, and incomprehensible power of creating out of bread and wine the flesh and blood of God himself. All these opinions they were enabled to spread and rivet among the people by reducing their minds to a state of sordid ignorance and staring timidity, and by infusing into them a religious horror of letters and knowledge. Thus was human nature chained fast for ages in a cruel, shameful, and deplorable servitude to him and his subordinate tyrants, who, it was foretold, would exalt himself above all that was called God and that was worshipped. In the latter, the Feudal Law, we find another system, similar in many respects to the former, which, although it was originally formed perhaps for the necessary defense of a barbarous people against the inroads and invasions of her neighboring nations, yet for the same purposes of tyranny, cruelty, and lust which had dictated the Canon Law, it was soon adopted by almost all the princes of Europe and wrought into the constitutions of their government. It was originally a code of laws for a vast army in a perpetual encampment. The general was invested with the sovereign propriety of all lands within the territory. Of him, as his servants and vassals, the first rank of his great officers held the lands, and in the same manner the other subordinate officers held all of them, and all ranks and degrees held their lands by a variety of duties and services, all tending to bind the chains the faster on every order for mankind. In this manner the common people were held together in herds and clans in a state of servile dependence on their lords, bound even by the tenure of their lands to follow them wherever, whenever they commanded, to their wars, and in a state of total ignorance of everything divine and human, excepting the use of arms and the culture of their lands. But another event still more calamitous to human liberty was a wicked confederacy between the two systems of tyranny above described. It seems to have been stipulated between them that the temporal grandees should contribute everything in their power to maintain the ascendancy of the priesthood, and that the spiritual grandees in their turn should employ their ascendancy over the consciences of the people in impressing on their minds a blind, implicit obedience to civil magistracy. Thus, as long as this confederacy lasted, and the people were held in ignorance, liberty, and with her knowledge and virtue too, seemed to have deserted the earth, and one age of darkness succeeded another, till God, in his benign providence, raised up the champions who began and conducted the Reformation. From the time of the Reformation to the first settlement of America, knowledge gradually spread in Europe, but especially in England, and in proportion as that increased and spread among the people, ecclesiastical and civil tyranny, which I use as synonymous expressions for the canon and feudal laws, seem to have lost their strength and weight. The people grew more and more sensible of the wrong that was done them by these systems, more and more impatient under it, and determined at all hazards to rid themselves of it, till at last, under the execrable race of the Stuarts, the struggle between the people and the Confederacy, aforesaid of temporal and spiritual tyranny, became formidable, violent, and bloody. It was this struggle that peopled America. It was not religion alone, as is commonly supposed, but it was a love of universal liberty and a hatred, a dread, a horror of the infernal confederacy before described that projected, conducted, and accomplished the settlement of America.